Last time, Madison thought she'd stumbled into something rare, a man who noticed her, not her mistakes. A stranger in a hotel lobby became late-night poetry and whispered confessions. But then one search revealed a truth she never expected. Ethan Cole wasn't just the man who held her when she panicked. He was a billionaire whose name could shift markets. Now, in part 2, the question grows heavier. Can fragile beginnings survive a world built on power, whispers, and doubt? The fundraiser was all warm light and polite applause, an event mapped in soft carpets, clinking glasses, and tiny plates of food people pretended to taste. Ethan had told her to meet him there because it mattered, not so he could parade her, he'd said, but because sometimes you show up not for the stage, but for the people the stage is supposed to serve. Madison wanted to believe him. She walked into the room feeling both exposed and oddly brave, the deep green dress she'd worried over moving with a small, honest grace. For a while, the night passed as Ethan had promised. Conversation that felt sincere, music that held back its volume just enough, the kind of small talk that lets the important things breathe. Then, somewhere near the terrace, voices thinned and sharpened. Two men stood with their backs to the city lights, leaning on a low wall and speaking as if the world were their private joke. "Cute," one said, the word threaded with contempt. "Temporary," the other replied, and because they thought no one was close enough to hear, they let a cruel certainty fall into the air. Cole always goes back to his own. It landed like ice. She held her breath and let the noise of the party become a faraway thing. For a brief, absurd second, she imagined stepping forward, correcting them, naming the fact that the people they dismissed had whole lives and stubborn hearts. Instead, she felt a heat in her face and that old, familiar tightening, the want to disappear rather than force a moment that might make someone else uncomfortable. Madison didn't argue. She slipped away, weaving through conversations and laughter that suddenly felt like the wrong kind of light. At the coat check, she paused, the street beyond a clean, driverless stretch of curb offering a kind of relief. She did not text him. She did not wait for him to find her. She hailed a cab and walked into the cold night with the weight of every whispered, temporary, pressing against the back of her throat. Ethan saw the cab pull away. He saw her silhouette in the rear window and something in him changed shape, not the grand, headline kind of thing that news stories are made of, but the small, irrevocable rearrangement of priorities. He spoke to the people he needed to speak to with the calm he usually kept for boardrooms, and then he chased the only thing he wanted to keep, the private person who refused to be a spectacle. A week of distance followed. The spaces between their texts lengthened. He called and let it go to voicemail. She read and deleted drafts she never sent. He sent small, unshowy reminders, a photograph of the poetry aisle where they'd sat, a note with a line of Neruda tucked into it, a message that read, "You were never small. You were simply holding yourself in so tightly that no one could see how big your heart was." Those words landed like a hand on the back of her neck, soothing, unnerving, true. Then, when quiet had stretched into something almost unbearable, he did something that surprised even the people who watched his life closely. On a gray afternoon when decisions were supposed to be practical and press releases possible, Ethan produced a folded lease from inside his coat and set it on the bookshop table between them. He did not make an announcement. He did not demand gratitude. He slid the paper toward her and said, slow and simple, "I bought the space next to Blue Harbor. No strings. It's yours if you want it." The offer was less a flourish than a removal of risk. "Take this," he was saying without saying the word, "and keep the dream safe." Madison's first instinct was to pull away. It felt like a rescue, and rescue had always smelled faintly of obligation. She pictured the headline versions of herself, a storefront with someone else's name on the deed, and felt something rise in her chest that wasn't gratitude. It was pride, stubborn and tender. She folded the paper back into two and tucked it into a side pocket of her coat as if it were a thing that might burn her fingers. "This is too much," she whispered, because saying nothing felt like a safe default. He listened, and he did not reach for the paper. In his eyes, there was no impatience, only a quiet that said he understood the kind of gift that could feel like a theft. And so the lease sat on her kitchen table like a cold, impossible possibility for days. She would make coffee and find herself watching the envelope, the landlord's name, the address that might be 1,000 small beginnings. It breathed against the domestic objects around it, and she could not make it feel like hers without feeling as if she had traded a piece of herself. That was the paradox. To accept the sanctuary someone loved enough to buy felt like relinquishing the chance to build the sanctuary by her own hands. Madison is not a person who shrinks from work. She had shelved a novel once because life demanded a steadier rhythm, and the ache of that unfinished story had been more companion than regret. With a stubbornness that surprised even her, she began to find small sums and make calls. She worked late shifts. She negotiated terms with a bank officer over the phone, with her coffee going cold beside her. When she finally walked into the landlord's office with a plain folder and a folded personal loan clutched in her hand, she felt like someone stepping over a line that had once felt absolute. She signed her name, not with the flourish of a person saved, but with the small, fierce satisfaction of someone who had chosen to own her life. She did not race to show Ethan. Pride was one reason. The other was that she wanted to prove to herself that the life she had dreamed of could be claimed on her terms. For 2 weeks, the signed lease sat on her kitchen table while she let the possibility settle into her bones. Then, on a cold, clear afternoon, she climbed the stairs to the rooftop where they had once shared a paperback and a thermos. She carried a small ceramic figurine between her hands, the bookstore he had sent after the voice message, and inside her coat, the real lease was folded and warm as a secret. He was there, elbows resting on the rail, the city laid out like a low constellation beneath them. He looked up when she arrived, and his face showed relief the way a tide eases, subtle, honest. She did not say anything at first. She set the figurine between them, and then she placed the lease into his hands, flat and real. "I needed it to be mine before I could be yours," she said, each word quiet but sure. His fingers closed around the paper like someone holding something fragile and precise. For a heartbeat, the rooftop was an island with nothing but the two of them. He swallowed, the motion small, and when he spoke, there was no public showman in his voice, only a man who had spent his life learning to be seen in 100 glass reflections, now choosing to be present in a single, unglamorous moment. "You don't have to let me into your life the way the world thinks you should," he said, and the words were not a bargain but a promise. "I never wanted to save you. I wanted to stand next to you while you built what was already yours." His laugh was a small, relieved sound. "So, is this yours now?" he asked, as if asking the lease to speak for her. When she smiled, the smile had a little of everything: relief, fatigue, a fierce satisfaction. "It's mine," she said. And in the way he looked at her, there was a softness that did not need to be printed in magazines. They stayed a while on that rooftop, talking about practical things like renovations, opening days, the little choices that make a place feel lived in, and impractical things, the poems they'd keep at the counter, the way light should fall across a reading nook. Planning a life together for them looked less like marquee headlines and more like lists of work to be done. Shelving, schedules, the small patterns of kindness. 6 months later, when the wooden sign went up above the door and the brass letters were hammered into place, the little shop glowed in the late afternoon like a secret finally shared. The first page smelled like coffee and paper and the faint citrus of new varnish. There were people in the chairs by the window who had once been strangers and were now regulars. Children left scrawled drawings on the community board. A stack of dog-eared poetry stood on the counter, thumbed through by the same woman who had once feared she'd never have a place to tell her own stories. Ethan was there most weekends, carrying boxes to the back, arranging displays, or reading in a corner with a mug in his hand. Sometimes he left an extra copy of a book in the window with no note attached, a small offering to whoever needed it. Madison moved through the shop with a kind of quiet authority that had nothing to do with the size of a bank account and everything to do with the steadiness of ownership. When she looked up and found him already watching, not as a benefactor inspecting his gift, but as a partner who delighted in the work, she felt the complicated relief of being known but not fixed. Their life together was not a neat story of rescue followed by a grateful heroine. It was, instead, the accumulation of tiny, ordinary days where choices were made again and again, to turn the page, to open the shop before dawn, to read when the world felt loud. The grand gestures were not absent. they had simply been redefined. A lease bought with no strings became a test of character when it was refused. A signed agreement taken by her hand was the real turning tide. The proof of love was not in the size of the check but in the willingness to stand in small rooms and do the work that keeps a life warm. If there is any final line to this chapter, it is small. Love in their world did not need the theater of headlines. It asked for presence, for steady hands and books repositioned just so, for the courage to claim a storefront and to give it away, only to the work of filling it. For Madison, the lesson was simple and portable. You can accept help without losing yourself, and you can refuse rescue while still letting someone in. The rest is quiet work.